Hi, and welcome to this AI in C# video on the Microsoft Agent Framework. Today we're gonna look how to connect to various different LLM providers, because it's still a myth that, okay, it's Microsoft works together with OpenAI, then Microsoft Agent Framework will probably not work with other than the OpenAI models. And that is far from the truth. So in this video, I'm going to show you 15 different providers that uses various ways of doing things. So let's get through it. First up, we take OpenAI. So OpenAI, of course, works with this. You can go to platform.openai.com and get some API keys. You need to sign up and pay $5 up front in order to use the platform. Once you have done that and have your API key, you need to install one NuGet package, Microsoft Agents AI.openai, which might seem preferential in that they have a specific package for it, but you will see later that many people use the OpenAI specification despite not being OpenAI themselves. And once we've done that, put in the NuGet package, we just new up an OpenAI client, give our API key, new up a chat client with our model, and create an AI agent. And once we have the agent, we can just do run async like normal. Moving on to Gemini from Google. Google have AI Studio .google.com where you can get your API keys, and if you need to do more corporate stuff, you need to go to the Google Cloud Platform. Google are not yet have an official NuGet package that works with .NET in general. It's very close to being there, so this package is from an unofficial source, but the second Google makes their own, you can switch out for that and use more or less the same code. But we again new up something. We new up a generative AI chat client with our key and model, and that is behind the scenes an iChat client, which we need in order to make a chat client agent. And then we can ask our hello. Anthropic, same procedure. They don't have an official package, but there's a fairly good package on NuGet. And together with Agents AI, we can go in and make an Anthropic client where we need to give the API key you get from console.anthropic.com. We can then new up the Anthropic client, take messages as builder.build, which will give us a chat client. And using that, we can new up our chat client. But special to Anthropic is that you need in chat options to set the model ID. And the max token count is a mandatory field. If you don't provide some kind of max tokens you're allowed to use per call, the run async would fail. Moving on to Mistral. Mistral have admin.mistral.ai, and we have again an unofficial Mistral SDK package together with agents. We then new up a Mistral client, and we make a .completions.create AI agent, and in here we again need to give the model ID in the chat options. But beyond that, it's very much like Anthropic when we can run async. Moving up onto XAI. XAI is one of the first that uses the OpenAI package, so all we need is that. We need to go to xai.com and we just new up a OpenAI client as if it was OpenAI. And the only difference is that we need to give in client options what endpoint. So we don't point to OpenAI, which is the default, but instead point to api.x.ai.v1. Once we've done that, it's exactly the same as OpenAI. Moving on to Azure OpenAI. Azure OpenAI needs its own NuGet package, but beyond the OpenAI, because it's slightly different. But beyond that, we just go to ai.azure.com to sign up for an account, deploy a model, which is something special compared to the others. The others you don't really deploy the model, but up in Azure you can deploy the model and give them other names than the default ones. I don't recommend you do that, but you can. Then you new up an Azure OpenAI client where you need to give an endpoint. Your endpoint would look either like this, or instead of OpenAI might say services instead, because they have switched fairly recently. The one warning is that up in Azure, you will on the front page of ai.azure.com see an endpoint. That is not the endpoint for Azure OpenAI, it's for the one called Microsoft Foundry. But the Azure AI endpoint you need to go to operate, admin, and parent resource in order to see this URI. But once you have that and you have your API key, you tell your model deployment name, and you just create an AI agent like normal, and we have our agent and response. Moving on to Microsoft Foundry, which is also up on ai.azure.com. So there's two ways of working with Microsoft here. This is the more corporate one, where your agents are actually being stored up in Azure. So instead of just newing up an agent, you actually create an entire agent and it will be persisted up in the cloud. In order to use this, you need to get the Microsoft Agents AI.Azure AI, because it have a special NuGet package, and inside that there is some Azure.ai.projects NuGet packages that are transient. Another thing about Microsoft Foundry is that you don't have an API key. You need to use the Azure credentials. In my case, I'm using CLI credentials, but you could use the default credentials, the Visual Studio credentials, or which one of the credentials. So it's like any other Azure resource. You then provide your endpoint, and then you use this AI project client in order to make some agents, and you create an agent with a name and some options. And the minimum option is a model, but you can also give instructions and stuff like that. Once you have made this agent, which is Microsoft Foundry specific, you can turn that agent into a Microsoft Agent Framework agent. And once you have that, you can do the normal run async. Moving on to Amazon and their Bedrock service. So you need to go to aws.amazon.com/bedrock. Amazon have its own official package that works with Microsoft Extension AI and then by proxy to Microsoft Agent Framework. What you need to do is you need to set an environment variable on the fly called AWS Bearer Token Bedrock, and you need to give your API token for that. Then you need to make a runtime client where you need to choose the region you are in. And then you can, from the runtime client, make a iChat client that can then be turned into an agent. You need to provide your model and be in mind, for example, that a Claude model that you want to use in EU needs to have an EU dot in front of it. But you see that up in their portal. Once we have that, we have our agent and we can do the normal run async. Moving on to Ollama, which is an offline model. So instead of a service you sign up to, you download a program and install it on your machine. You then use an unofficial package called Ollama Sharp and the agent NuGet package. You then new up an Ollama API client with your local host and port and what model you want to use. And there you also get an iChat client back because it's behind the scenes, one of those. You make your agent and you just do your normal run and get response. Microsoft also has, similar to Ollama, something called Foundry Local. Again, this is an offline system. And instead of a service, you do a winget install on your machine, and you then get your Foundry Local. On Mac, it's slightly different, but again, it's a downloadable system that you put on your system. Then you use a package directly for that, Microsoft AI.Foundry Local, and you use OpenAI because behind the scenes it's running OpenAI. You then choose your model and you start your model, which will download it if it's not already downloaded. And you get some model info back from that model that you then get your endpoint for and your model ID. Because you can't give your model alias down here, you need to give the specific model ID, because behind the scenes it will figure out if your machine have an NPU that it can use, or it needs to use your graphics card or your CPU instead. We then get a client for that in our OpenAI client, like normal, with an endpoint, and the rest is like normal. Now we move on to some of the ones that are portals for many different models out there in the world. One of them is OpenRouter, that have more or less every available LLM at your disposal, which goes to them as a proxy. They use OpenAI as well, or can use OpenAI. They have their own API as well, but it's easier to just use OpenAI. And in their case, it's just a normal API key. And again, OpenAI, you need to specify their endpoint, which is openrouter.ai.api/v1, and then the rest is normal. Together.ai is very similar to OpenRouter. They work exactly the same way with the same NuGet package, but instead it has an endpoint called API together.xyz/v1. And that is, again, one of the reasons why there is an OpenAI dedicated package here, because all of them almost use it. Because Cohere is exactly the same, another one of these providers that offers various models, and exactly the same code, just yet another endpoint, API cohere.ai/compatibility/v1. And Hugging Face is also the same. They call them tokens, their API keys, but beyond that, it's again OpenAI, router.huggingface.co/v1, and we get our normal agent. And finally, we have GitHub models, which is a slightly different way. You go to your GitHub and get a personal access token like you would with other integrations, and there you need to give it model access. Once you do that, it uses something called azure.ai.inference for connection. And in order to do that, it also needs an extra Microsoft extension AI package. Beyond that, we take the normal agent, we take our PAT token, our model, and then we new up a chat completion client from AI Inference. We give our URI, we give our PAT token, and when we give our clients, we can get an iChat client back that we can then turn into an agent. And once we have that, we can, as always, do the run. So as you can see, many of them are OpenAI based, and the few others that are there have their own NuGet package that can easily be turned into an iChat client, which is the magic of everything, because as soon as we have that, everything just works in the agent framework. So Agent Framework is definitely not OpenAI only, Microsoft only. You can use almost whatever. So with that, see you in the next one.